Today we will learn and reflect on the courageous reporting by Ida B. Wells on the evils of lynching. We often encounter whites who contest the history of lynchings and race riots, who believe that the history of lynchings is a radical left communist propaganda that has no basis in fact. To counter this, we offer the history and reporting of Ida B. Wells, a brave black woman of modest circumstances who chose to crusade against the evils of lynchings and murders of blacks that go unpunished. Brave because she risked death at the hands of white supremacists who detested the truths she was printing in the newspapers of her day. We will periodically pause the reports of these gruesome and grisly and gory lynchings, which are necessary to acknowledge that they really did happen, and could happen again, with essays on civil rights topics by Ida B. Wells. At the end of our talk, we'll discuss the sources used for this video. Feel free to follow along in the PowerPoint script we uploaded SlideShare. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. Ida B. Wells was born in Mississippi during the Civil War, which means she would not have remembered when she was freed by the Emancipation Proclamation by the end of the war. Her father, Jim Wells, was active in the Mississippi Republican Party, braving the KKK vigilante justice that discouraged blacks from voting and participating in politics. Her parents encouraged her to stand up for her rights. The childhood memories of Ida B. Wells included her mother pacing the floor at night when her father was at a political meeting, wondering and praying, would he arrive home alive? And the young adult pictures of Ida B. Wells looked like the pictures of a teenager, and she was forced to grow up and start working very early. When she was 16 and out of town visiting her grandparents, yellow fever struck, and both her parents passed away from the fever. She rushed back home when she heard the news, only to find out that her father's Masonic Lodge brothers were planning to divvy up her siblings among several families. Ida B. Wells, although she was only 16 at the time, firmly stated she would do everything she could to keep the family together. She had not even finished the equivalent of high school, but she had her dress lengthened, lied about her age, and took a job as an elementary school teacher. Now, she was underqualified, and she had to study herself to complete her education. To earn more money, she got a job teaching school in Memphis, Tennessee, and soon started working for the local black newspaper. She wrote biting articles and editorials under the pen name of Iola, the Princess of the Press, and then she became the newspaper's editor and publisher as well as a writer, and in 1889 became co-owner of the black newspaper, the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight. And she married fellow journalist and attorney Ferdinand Lee Barnett, and they had 5 children together. Now, Ida B. Wells risked her life by reporting on the racial violence in the Deep South. In early March 1892, 3 black businessmen, including Thomas Moss, a close friend, were the victims of a lynching incident. The initial incident was a squabble between white and black boys over a game of marbles. One of the white fathers whipped one of the black boys, and the black men protested the whipping. That night, a white mob stormed the blacks who hung out at the People's Grocery Store and were met with gunfire from blacks who were guarding the store. But the next day, the white mob returned, threw 30 blacks in jail, looted the store, and terrorized the neighborhood blacks. And another white mob raided the jail and lynched the 3 black businessmen whose store successfully had competed against another white grocery store nearby. Now, historically, lynchings were justified by the myth that black men were eager to rape white women, and that white womanhood needed to be protected. Spurred by her knowledge of the details of this lynching of a dear friend, Ida B. Wells started to research the history of other lynchings, discovering that for the most part, lynchings had no connection at all to any intimate acts, and where there was intimacy, the white woman consented, which was so repugnant that it enraged white men of the day. Now, Ida B. Wells reported on this lynching and 3 other lynchings of 8 black men in 1 week in late May 1892, and 5 of these were for rape, although, as Ida B. Wells wrote, "Nobody in this country believes the old threadbare lie that Negro men rape white women." Ida B. Wells recalls that her business partner had to leave town to escape the mob that ransacked the office and destroyed the building, and that letters and telegrams sent to me in New York where I was vacationing advised me that bodily harm awaited my return. Creditors took possession of the newspaper office and sold the outfit, and the free speech was as if it had never been. And the sheriff did nothing. The courts did nothing. And even if the case had made it to the courts, no jury would convict white men for crimes committed against blacks. Now, Ida B. Wells moved north to Harlem, accepting a position with the newspaper New York Age, and continued her anti-lynching campaign in articles and editorials. Was she able to move her possessions to New York? We hope so. Dr. Wikipedia does not mention a mob destroying her house in Memphis. Now, soon afterwards, she gives a speech to the National Press Association where she proclaims, "The lyncher has become so bold, he has discarded his mask in the secrecy of night, and has invaded the jails and prisons of our largest cities, and hung and tortured his victims on the public streets." Not content with this, Arkansas furnishes the spectacle of a woman vindicating her honor by setting fire to a living being, who, as the flames licked his burning flesh, dies protesting his innocence to the crowd of 5,000 who looked on and applauded the act in ghoulish glee. And Ida B. Wells has more examples of lynchings. A 15-year-old girl in Louisiana suspected of poisoning a whole family is promptly hung on that suspicion. 3 reputable citizens of Memphis were taken from the jail and shot to death for prospering too well in business and defending themselves and their property. And one of the journals, which used to be a member of your organization, and she's referring to herself, of course, has been silenced by the edict of the mob, which has declared that there shall be no such thing as free speech in the South. Now, the Reconstruction era had ended, and the federal troops had left the South long ago. And since the Southern sheriffs and police were now in charge, and sometimes participated in the lynchings, every year their outrages against blacks became more and more brazen. How many blacks were lynched and murdered during and after the Civil War? Studies in newspapers and other sources estimate that up to 6,400 Americans were lynched. Now, past studies some years back estimate about 4,500 total deaths, and about 3/4 of these were black. Now, it's unclear whether this includes the number of blacks who died in race riots around the early 20th century. But it definitely does not include the other reports of mass graves of blacks worked to death as convict laborers in the mines and on especially cruel plantations. Although we have not found any speculation of the true number of blacks who died, likely the true number of blacks who were lynched and murdered are in the range of 10,000 souls to 20,000 souls, or even more. Ida B. Wells sensed this sliding into the abyss. Lynchers belong to the race which holds Negro life cheap and owns the telegraph wires and newspapers. They write reports justifying lynching by painting the Negro as black as possible, and those reports are accepted by the Press Association and the world without question or investigation. The mob spirit has increased with alarming frequency and violence. Over 1,000 men, women, and children have thus been sacrificed in the past 10 years. Masks have long since been thrown aside, and the lynchings now take place in broad daylight. The sheriffs, police, and state officials stand by and see the work well done. The coroner's jury is often formed among those who took part in the lynching, and a verdict, death at the hands of parties unknown to the jury, is rendered. And as the number of lynchings have increased, so has the cruelty and barbarity of the lynchers. Now, the abolitionist leader, Frederick Douglass, wrote a letter of encouragement to Ida B. Wells in late 1892. Dear Miss Wells, let me give you thanks for your faithful paper on the lynch abomination now generally practiced against colored people in the South. There has been no word equal to it in convincing power. I have spoken, but my word is feeble in comparison. Brave woman, you have done your people and mine a service which can neither be weighed nor measured. And if American conscience were only half Christianized, if American moral sensibility were not hardened by persistent infliction of outrage and crime against colored people, a scream of horror, shame, and indignation would rise to heaven wherever your pamphlet shall be read. But alas, even crime has power to reproduce itself and create conditions favorable to its own existence. It sometimes seems we are deserted by earth and heaven, yet we must still think, speak, and work, and trust in the power of a merciful God for final deliverance. Although he had limited education, Frederick Douglass proved to the world that even an ex-slave could be a spellbinding orator and master of the English language, if given the chance and the freedom to read and study. He was a best-selling author. His most famous work was his slave autobiography, and which was later updated with his subsequent experiences as an abolitionist leader in another best-selling autobiography many decades later. And now for more lynchings. Ida B. Wells tells us about a story about a lynching that was put into motion by a theft by a white man that was enabled by the courts. Hamp Biscoe was a hard-working, thrifty farmer who lived near England, Arkansas, on a small farm with his family. The white man then tried to collect on a fictional debt of $100, a large sum for those days. Biscoe refused to pay the demand. The white man brought suit, obtained a judgment for the $100, and Biscoe's farm was sold to pay the judgment. The suit, judgment, and subsequent legal proceedings appear to have driven Biscoe almost crazy and brooding over his wrongs, and he grew to be a confirmed lunatic. He would allow but a few men, white or colored, to come to his place, as he suspected every stranger to be planning to steal his farm. His neighbor then tore down his fence. Biscoe threatened him, and his neighbor secured a warrant for his arrest. Lawmen came, guns drawn, guns were fired, shooting both Biscoe and his wife. When the neighbors heard the news, of course a small mob gathered, coming to guard the guilty family. Afterwards, the young son explained what happened next. He saw a tall young man shoot his father and another man shoot his pregnant mother. After they had killed him, his mother's shooter pulled off her stockings and took $200 she had hidden there. And after the article was published, an investigator wrote to find out what had been done in the matter, and he received this answer from the sheriff. The parties who killed Hamp Biscoe have never been arrested. The parties are still in the country. It is done by some of the citizens, and those who know will not tell. Now in 1904, Ida B. Wells joined WEB Dubois in denouncing Booker T. Washington in a symposium on the Negro problem from the Negro point of view. Now Washington was known as an accommodationist, but as the decades passed, many other black leaders complained that he was too accommodating. Many started to wonder if he was more part of the problem of continuing racist attitudes than part of the solution. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois is known for his groundbreaking history, Black Reconstruction, which documented how ex-slaves were an important part of the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction. In an essay afterwards, Ida B. Wells concedes that the supporters of Booker T. Washington cherish the most tender memories of the Northern teachers who endured ostracism, insult, and martyrdom to bring the spelling bee and Bible to educate those who had been slaves, founding many black schools. Without these schools, including Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute, Negroes would have been in a hopeless position. With their aid, our race has made more remarkable intellectual and material progress in 40 years than any other race in history. They have given us thousands of teachers for our black schools in the South, physicians to heal our ailments, druggists, lawyers, and ministers. They have given us over 2,000 black college graduates, over half of whom own property worth over $1,000 per capita. But they also note that Washington's emphasis on providing only trade education for blacks can limit the aspirations of blacks and give whites the wrong impression that a trade education is all that should be provided for blacks. Ida B. Wells opines that industrial education for the Negro is Booker T. Washington's hobby. He believes that for the masses of the Negro race, an elementary education of the brain and a continuation of education for the hand is not only the best kind of education, but he knows it is the most popular with the white South. And he also knows that the Negro is the butt of ridicule with the average white American, who always enjoys a joke that portrays the Negro as illiterate and improvident, and a petty thief or a happy-go-lucky inferior. Ida B. Wells may be exaggerating when she says that some say Mr. Washington represents the masses and seeks to depict the life and needs of the black belt. There is a feeling that he does not do that when he will tell a cultured body of women like the Chicago Women's Club the following story. Well, I wonder if he actually told her the story, but anyway. Well, John, I am glad to see you're raising your own hogs. Yes, sir, Mr. Washington. Ever since you had done told us about raising our own hogs, we niggers round here have resolved to quit stealing hogs and going to raise our own. And to be sure you do not miss the point of the joke, she adds. The inference is that the Negroes of the Black Belt were hog thieves until the coming of Tuskegee. Now, as we discussed in our video on Booker T. Washington, there will always be a necessary tension between the schools of the accommodationist Booker T. Washington and the activist W.E.B. Du Bois. And out of necessity, since she was campaigning against lynching, Ida B. Wells was solidly in the activist camp. Now, Washington, in his autobiography, does indeed condemn lynching and supports black suffrage, but I'm sure you can also find quotes by him elsewhere on these sensitive topics that are embarrassingly accommodating. Now, the problem was that when he founded Tuskegee, the only blacks with a liberal education could find were his teachers or his Pullman railroad porters, and the only other jobs whites would entrust to blacks were in agriculture or the trades. Now, from the very beginning, his schools were heavily dependent on giving from white philanthropists, including many robber barons seeking to redeem themselves through their charity. And Booker T. Washington really was a salesman, and he spent decades patiently calling on these wealthy individuals year after year after year, coaxing more and more and more of their donations. Now, if Booker T. Washington had shifted gears towards activism later in his life, and he lived until his 90s, these spigots of cash would have been quickly turned off. And now on to some more gruesome, gory, grisly lynchings. Ida B. Wells tells of an especially brutal lynching where the black Sam Hose was accused of murdering his boss and assaulting his wife. There was no trial. As she reports, a white man had been killed, and a white woman was said to have been assaulted. That was enough. When Hose was found, he had to die. And the newspaper offered a $500 reward for capture, Ida B. Wells reports. After he had been apprehended, it was publicly announced that he would be burned alive. Excursion trains were run and bulletins were put up in the small towns. And many fair ladies drove out in their carriages to witness the torture and burning of this human being. Sam's Hose's ears were cut off, then his toes and his fingers, and passed around to the crowd as souvenirs. His eyes were put out, and his tongue torn out, and flesh cut in strips with knives. And finally they poured coal oil on him and burned him to death. Ida B. Wells has more research and stories to press home the fact that black suffrage would be the only enduring solution to the problem of lynching and racial violence. That even when blacks have a small minority of public offices, this is often enough to at least publicize any acts of barbarity and cruelty. Ida B. Wells explains, with no sacredness of the ballot, there can be no sacredness of human life itself. For if the strong can take the weak man's ballot, then when it suits his purpose to do so, he will take his life also. Having successfully swept away the constitutional safeguards to the ballot, it is the smallest of matters for the South to sweep aside its own safeguards to human life. Thus, trial by jury for the black man has become a mockery, a plaything of the ruling classes and the rabble alike. The mob says, "This people has no vote with which to punish us or the consenting officers of the law. Therefore, we indulge our brutal instincts, give free rein to race prejudice, and lynch and hang and burn them whenever we please." Therefore, the more complete the disenfranchisement, the more frequent and horrible have been the hangings and shootings and burnings. And she has a section where she retells many tales of how lynched Negroes were burned alive. She reports that in 1891, Ed Coy was burned to death in Texarkana, Arkansas. He was charged with assaulting a white woman, and after the mob had tied him to a tree, the men and boys amused themselves for some time sticking knives into Coy's body and slicing off pieces of flesh. When they had amused themselves sufficiently, they poured coal oil over him, and the woman in the case set fire to him. And it was said that 15,000 people stood by and watched him burn. This was on a Sunday night, and the press reports told how the people looked on while the Negro burned to death. Ida B. Wells also reports that in July 1893 in Bardwell, Kentucky, C.J. Miller was burnt to ashes. Since his death, this man has been found to be absolutely innocent of the murder of the two white girls with which he was charged. But the mob would wait for no justification. They insisted that, as they were not sure he was the right man, they would compromise the matter by hanging him instead of burning him. Not to be outdone, then they took the body down and made a huge bonfire out of it. Now, the number of lynchings did gradually decrease over the years, perhaps partially as the result of the bright lights of constant publicity shown on this evil. During World War I, many black men volunteered to serve in the military, and when they returned home, they expected some progress in improving their civil rights. And this progress was not forthcoming in a Wilson administration that had deeply racist attitudes. Perhaps individual lynchings declined since these returning black veterans were not only armed but knew how to use their arms. Now instead, the white rage erupted in many race riots, where the colored sections of many cities were burned down, again with no justice for the black man. Ida B. Wells reports, a peaceful, law-abiding, hard-working group of about 200 blacks gathered in their church at Hoop Spur, Alabama, to attend a lodge meeting in the year 1919. Suddenly, at 11 p.m., without warning, a volley of shots are fired into this free assembly. The lights go out, and those who are not killed or wounded get away as quickly as possible. One white man, W.A. Adkins, is killed out in front of this church. Whether by the men he is with or with the guards out front will probably never be known. No one knows how many of these peaceable, unoffending Negroes were killed by this volley, as the person who did this dastardly deed burned the church down the next day so no bullet holes in walls, broken windows, or dead bodies of Negroes would show the conspiracy of whites to kill black people. It is because that one white man was killed in front of the Negro church that night that a dozen Negroes are in the Arkansas prison condemned to die. Ida B. Wells reported that the cotton crop had been brought in, and many of the sharecropping Negroes did not want to be cheated as usual. They were negotiating too sharply to maximize their fair share of the crop. With the men in prison, then the mobs descended on their families' houses, and with nobody to protect them, their wives and children were all driven out, and all their clothing and possessions were seized. They were both husbandless and homeless, depending on public charity, and this story goes on for 15 pages. And we reviewed a very similar story in our video on the 1619 Project, where a black man was murdered, the family business, home, and savings were stolen from his widow, and his family was forced to flee simply because his business had become too successful, which meant he'd become too uppity, in the words of local whites. Now, Ida B. Wells also reports on the East St. Louis, Illinois, 1917 race riot that raged for a full day. More than 100 Negroes were killed. Thousands were driven from their homes. More than 60 Negro homes were burned, with $500,000 in fire damages. Now, rather than putting down the riot, whites and the National Guard and the police department participated in the riot, and this sparked a congressional investigation into this horrible event. And she describes the events with multiple eyewitnesses that go on for 40 ugly pages of evil callousness and uncaring cruelties against the blacks of the city. Lynching was all too common, but how about gator baiting? Was gator baiting a real thing? Now, gator baiting is when white hunters hunt alligators using black toddlers as bait, tying the black toddlers to a log near a swamp full of gators, and if they fuss and cry, so much the better, because such a ruckus will attract the gators that much quicker. Now, Dr. Wikipedia says that although scattered references to the supposed practice of gator baiting appeared in early 20th century newspapers, there's no credible evidence that the stereotype reflected an actual historical practice. But then if you click on the footnotes for the supporting Scopes articles, Scopes does reference credible evidence that gator baiting possibly was a real thing, or at least it was widely discussed, as we have postcards with little black babies with grinning gators. Now, we all hope this would happen rarely. What a horrible thought. Now, we know that lynchings and murders of blacks were rarely prosecuted and tried, but we would hope that the rare Southern sheriff and jury would provide justice in a gator baiting case. Snopes even has a copy of a grotesque lullaby written to sing babies to sleep, and the title of the lullaby is Mammy's Little Alligator Bait, which starts, "Oh, hush baby, don't you cry. Mammy's little pickaninny's going to get a present mighty soon." I don't know what that present's going to be, but anyway, it ends with, "Go to sleep, don't you peep, listen to me tell you, yo's mammy little alligator bait." How's a baby supposed to go to sleep thinking about how he's going to become alligator bait? This shows really how callous whites were to blacks. And we'll conclude with this section that we also reviewed in the Nazi Lawyers. And I'm sharing this because this is what drove me to study more deeply the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction and civil rights. And mine eyes were open when I first read about the history of the defeat of the Anti-Lynching Bill in 1938. Eleanor Roosevelt and the black leaders were pushing FDR in Congress to pass the Anti-Lynching Bill when the entire world was witnessing the horrors of the Nazi persecution of the Jews. FDR was sympathetic. He explained to a colleague that the Southerners, by reason of the seniority rule in Congress, are chairmen of the key congressional committees. If I come out for the anti-lynching bill, they will block every bill I ask Congress to pass to keep America from collapsing, and I just can't take that risk. So FDR had a choice. He could fight the Nazis, or he could fight lynching, but he could not do both. And defeating the Nazis was an attainable goal. Now, Eleanor persisted in public speeches and in her newspaper column in support of the anti-lynching campaign, and she was constantly badgering her husband about this. Once she asked FDR, "Do you mind if I say what I think?" And FDR replied, You can see anything you like. I can always say, well, that is my wife. I can't do anything about her. And the supposed conflict was a good political way to push for civil rights without unduly antagonizing the powerful Deep South senators and congressmen. And what's distressing about this history was the bill was not against lynching itself, but it would have put legal pressure on Southern justices and policemen to enforce the law and punish those who were guilty of lynching, instead of just ignoring the crime. Now we'll discuss the sources we used for this video. Our main source is this excellent compilation of the writings of Ida B. Wells, plus some good biographical information in the introductions, in the beginning of the book, and in the start of each chapter. Her writing style is similar to the style of Frederick Douglass. She can be rather long-winded, but is also very eloquent and very thorough in her reporting. And No Ordinary Time by Dorothy Kearns Goodwin is where we pulled the story about FDR and Eleanor and the anti-lynching bill. And this is one of the most excellent histories I've ever read, and I highly recommend it. The YouTube description links to the video script and our blog. Please support our channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons, and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. And please click on the links for interesting videos on other topics that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul. Thank you.